If we're going to talk about the most underrated James Bond, let me vote now for Timothy Dalton. He did 1987's The Living Daylights, having turned the role down beforehand. He did 1989's really hard-edged License to Kill. He was gritty before it was trendy to be gritty, and he was supposed to do a third film. Let's get into the story of the lost Timothy Dalton James Bond movie and just what went wrong.
We would be honoured if you would join us.
Let's go to 1989 to start the story. License to Kill has come out. Timothy Dalton's second film as James Bond 007. A film famously the first Bond film not made in the UK because of assorted tax machinations and things like that. And also the first James Bond film in the UK to have a 15 certificate. Now, this has been recorded in 2025, where GoldenEye's uncut version now has a 15 certificate. They remain here in the UK the only two James Bond films with that harsh a certificate. But License to Kill is a really hard-edged revenge thriller. And I mean, for an assortment of reasons, it just didn't click with audiences in 1989. Audiences didn't have as much taste in 1989, I would suggest. I was one of them. It was the summer of Batman. It was the summer of Lethal Weapon 2. And for an audience that had been schooled with Roger Moore James Bond films, I really like them. I really enjoy them. But, quite a light tone to a lot of them. Dalton's take on 007 was a real change. I mean, a much harsher portrayal of the character, and it was something Dalton really was keen to get across when he took the role on. He wanted to make sure that you believed in this character no matter what situation he was in. Now, the aftermath of License to Kill, there were problems. Albert R. Broccoli, the legendary James Bond producer, wasn't said to be particularly happy with the response to License to Kill. Its box office was down. Its reviews were confused. I mean, some people saw it for what it was. A lot of people were quite cold on it. And so while Broccoli was happy that Timothy Dalton would fulfill his 3-film contract as James Bond and would press ahead with a third movie with Dalton in the tuxedo, I should have worn one, he was making changes. John Glenn, the person who directed like the last 4 or 5 Bond films, he moved on. Richard Mayborn had just written the screenwriter right through the 80s on Bond. He moved on as well. And so as James Bond entered the 1990s, Broccoli knew that things had to change. Wasn't stopping in making the films. Throughout the 80s, there was that 2-year cycle. You could rely on a new James Bond film every 2 years. And at the Cannes Film Festival in 1990, there was the big advert for the 17th James Bond movie. And we all sat back and just kind of assumed this would be out in 1991. Timothy Dalton would be starring. Right, business as usual. Only it wasn't. So there were a couple of stories developed for what could and should have been Timothy Dalton's third film. Michael G. Wilson, who's only recently stepped back from the James Bond world, and a writer by the name of Alphonse Ruggiero Jr., were first to come up with an idea for where this would go. And my old friend and colleague Mark Harrison has detailed this on the website at Film Stories. And their idea was tying into what was happening then with Hong Kong, that Hong Kong was at this point about to be handed over by the UK to China. And so could they weave that in a little bit? And then what about putting a techno thriller in there? What about bringing in some robotics? And so they came up with this idea that started at a Scottish nuclear plant and would have involved a 30-something British Chinese entrepreneur and a threat to all the military computers on planet Earth. And so then there was the robotic side of it that would have had machines just sort of going wrong a little bit. And there was sort of a cyborg character that was said to be in the script, which involved a weird fight scene. And on the one hand, you had this really gritty Timothy Dalton era James Bond. On the other, I mean, it was the invisible car moment, really. This potential cyborg would come in for a bit of a scrap. And I mean, Moonraker, anyone? When Bond heads heavily into sci-fi, it doesn't quite work. Didn't help also that James Cameron was making Terminator 2 Judgment Day around this time as well. But still, for a while, the techno Hong Kong version of Timothy Dalton 007-3 was bubbling. I mean, it wasn't dismissed quickly. In fact, a pair of screenwriters, William Osborne and William Davies, who'd penned Twins for Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito, they then developed Alphonse Ruggiero Jr. and Michael G. Wilson's idea, put a treatment together. Albert R. Broccoli reached out to a whole bunch of directors. Ted Kotcheff, who's only recently just died, had directed Rambo: First Blood. John Landis was one of those who was just like, an inquiry went out to him, and then the concept work was ongoing for the robots as well. So the idea, had this version of the film happened, they would shoot it in China and Hong Kong in 1990. But what derailed it really, apart from someone hopefully sticking their hand up and saying, hang on, was a whole bunch of lawsuits coming through. And these actually would derail James Bond for 5-6 years, really. These were at this point over international broadcast rights for the 007 saga, and Albert R. Broccoli would have to hand over, and chose to hand over, the control of the James Bond films to Michael G. Wilson and Barbara Broccoli, his daughter, to allow him to sort out all the legalities of it. And so time goes on. Timothy Dalton's still contracted. You get to summer 1991, where most of us were sort of expecting to see his third film. And then Albert R. Broccoli takes a drastic step. He puts the rights to James Bond and the Danjaq company, controlling company, up for sale. Amongst the potential suitors at that point was producer Joel Silver. Now, Joel Silver, your archetype Hollywood loudmouth producer, to the point where when Robert Zemeckis made the film Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and they needed like your grumpy bastard shouty producer at the start of the film, they were just saying, we need someone like Joel Silver. Let's just get Joel Silver. Now, if he had got hold of Bond at that point, he had the idea of having Mel Gibson playing James Bond 007. That went nowhere in the end. It was talked about for a while. The deal wasn't done, but time was ticking on, and James Bond was off screen for the longest at that point. It had been for an awfully long time, really. Dalton was having like a kind of wobble about the role as well. Would he, once all the legalities were sorted out, would he still want to continue? And I mean, it was a question mark, and his view was probably not. And in fact, it took a long time to sort a lot of the legal stuff out. I think it wasn't until the end of 92, early 93. And only then, in the spring of 1993, I think it was the May, that Eon, the company behind James Bond, announced that, yes, James Bond 17 is going ahead. Michael France this time has been hired to write the story. He was just having success with the film Cliffhanger at that point. And then the idea there was this was going to be set in Russia. It was going to be called, wouldn't you know it, GoldenEye, but it was a very different GoldenEye, set in the era of Russian disarmament. And this time it would see James Bond trailing August Trevelyan, another 00 agent, which sort of happens in GoldenEye anyway, who's defected to Russia during the Cold War. He betrays the British Secret Service, and so there's a bit of score settling to go on, and there's a satellite weapon that the Russians have control of. So a fair few of the ingredients we see in the resultant GoldenEye that we ultimately got, but a much more action-heavy version of the script. At that point, Michael France delivers his draft for what was or wasn't going to be Timothy Dalton 3. And yeah, I mean, there were ingredients here that just wouldn't have fitted into basically into one script. And as Mark Harrison noted, that the script for GoldenEye that Michael France wrote was written with Timothy Dalton very much in mind. And in fact, it got to the point where with the press was speculating that Dalton was moving on. And a statement comes out from Eon saying, no, Timothy Dalton is indeed, quote, the Bond of record. And the truth was, Dalton was still interested in the world of James Bond, and with shooting now set to push to early 1994 with a view of release the end of 94, that at that point seemed vaguely likely. Well, Dalton took a look at this script and thought, yeah, there's something there, really. And the idea was, now the legalities were sorted, Eon could get back to the idea of let's do a James Bond film every 2 years. Let's get it back in. So Dalton's now interested again. The France draft has got him back to a degree. The fact that the film can move forward certainly helps as well. And I mean, Eon is confident enough that it brings in writers to start developing what James Bond 18 and 19 would be. And those two these should be set around Timothy Dalton as Bond. John Cork and Richard Smith came in to write the treatments for those. And the idea was, now we can get moving again. Let's get Timothy Dalton to sign a new contract, but not just for one film. Let's see if we can do 3 or 4. Dalton then had a decision to make. Do you want to return to the role of James Bond? It's up to you. And the thing is, we want you not to do just this one film. We want 3-4 picture commitment off you. And that was the breaking point in the story for Dalton. That on the 11th of April 1994, he formally announced that he'd retired from the role of James Bond, that he'd had the option to do a 3rd film, but he opted to walk away. Now, there was a point where if the legalities hadn't hit after License to Kill, that Dalton would have automatically gone straight on into the next Bond film. It would have come out in 91. So at that point, it was out of his hands. By the time it came round to GoldenEye, the first draft of GoldenEye, it was in his hands, but on the condition that, and there are various different versions of this story, but this seems to be the main thread, on the condition, well, we want you to sign a long-term commitment. We need to get Bond up and running again. It had already been off screen for, nearly 5 years by the time Dalton hung up his tuxedo, and the Bond films were not the kind of films that were off screen for that amount of time. I mean, they are now at the point of recording. But, the world was changing. The whole conversation was, is Bond still going to be relevant? I mean, True Lies comes out, about 94, was it? True Lies comes out. It's just like, hang on, isn't that James Bond now? How can you do a James Bond film when that's kind of up the stakes? And of course, Bond's reinvented itself lots as Jason Bourne's come along, as cinema's gone darker, as cinema's gone lighter. It's always kind of responded to that. It was later in 94 that Pierce Brosnan would, again, someone who had a brush with Bond before, finally would take on the role. And it would be GoldenEye, based loosely on Michael Francis' script. Bruce Fierstein came in, Jeffrey Kane came in and did a lot of the rewrite work. Well, they rewrote it, basically, changed the roles. And yeah, I mean, it was now a new future for James Bond. But the Timothy Dalton era had prematurely ended and denied us, at the very least, a 3rd film. Now, Dalton had been making noises, it's worth noting, after License to Kill, that this might be it. He was quoted as saying, "My feeling is this will be the last one. I don't mean my last one. I mean the end of the whole lot." I mean, he had doubts over Bond just as a franchise going forward. He says, "I don't speak with any real authority, but it's sort of a feeling I have." But then the box office was going down. The world was changing. The Cold War at that point was coming to an end. Technology was rising. Were people interested in this kind of old school spy character that Ian Fleming had imagined and brought to life? Dalton had doubts, and there were an assortment of doubts from the creatives around at the time. 1995's GoldenEye put those doubts away. And at the point we record now, it's 2025, and Bond has been off screen for 4 years, isn't going to come back for a couple more. It's the longest gap. It will be the longest gap since that gap between License to Kill in 89, GoldenEye in 95. We had the pandemic gap that delayed No Time to Die. But at the point this has been recording, it was 6 years ago, a Bond film was shooting. And that was panic stations at the end of the 80s, early 90s, for Bond to be away quite so long. Had things turned out a different way, had the legalities been sorted quicker, had Timothy Dalton just been, I don't know, a whole confluence of circumstances. But at the very least, in the summer of 1991, while we were lining up to watch Terminator 2, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, Hudson Hawk, Backdraft, do you remember this summer? There could have been Timothy Dalton as James Bond at least one last time, fighting a British-Chinese entrepreneur and his weird robot. Imagine what cinema's missed out on. I certainly think, all joking aside, the James Bond franchise has missed out a little bit, really, by not having a bit more Dalton in it. Would we have the Daniel Craig era if it wasn't for Timothy Dalton? Would we have Casino Royale if we hadn't had License to Kill, just like doing a lot of the pathfinding for the franchise first? An awful lot of questions. I mean, I come back to where I start. Timothy Dalton, the underrated James Bond, and his 3rd movie just feels like a really sadly lost James Bond outing.